light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I wanted to offer some thoughts and reflections on, well, it's kind of about time, but it's more about what pattern does time take. Is it linear? Is it sequential? Is it cyclical? Is it a spiral, as some say? Does history repeat itself? There's certainly commonality between one time and another, but I don't know that we really do ourselves any favors by calling it a repetition of history. In some ways, you might say it's a refinement of human lessons, that in this age we did it this way, in this age we're doing a similar sort of thing but in a different way. And when we look at both of those and figure out what was right and wrong with both and what was right that was common to both, we begin to get to a more refined understanding of what, after all, is the effective, holistic, healthy, desirable way to be in this situation. I mean, ultimately, all religion and all philosophy comes down to the basic question of how then should we live? What do I do with each day? How do I respond to the person who has rewarded me, the person who has hurt me, the person who has been a loyal friend, the person who has betrayed me? How do I respond to my own failures and accomplishments? How do I respond to being imperfect? Some people have stressed the pursuit of perfection. On some level, it may sound a bit cynical, but I don't know if we'll ever get to perfection. I don't know if we should, but I don't think for that reason that we should stop pursuing it. In that sense, there's a sense in which we begin a search, and as we find all the details and the pieces of it, we may find again and again in so many situations, well, now we're back where we started. Yes and no. We'll never be back where we started, because now we have a whole collection of memories of attempts and struggles and relationships and interactions that we didn't have before. So, in a sense, history will never repeat itself. Not exactly. Not with the same players, not in the same way. It kind of reminds me of, throughout high school, I always wanted the painting classes. I so much wanted to learn how to work with paints and do these fantastic images that I had that I had imagined. But unfortunately, as I got to my junior and senior years of high school, the funding for the art department was cut, and the programs were cut, and the classes that I'd waited 2 or 3 years for were no longer available to me. And it was quite frustrating. And a couple years later, however, I did find that a local arts supply store in my hometown, that it was the wife of the owner of the store who had arranged to have a painting class in the basement of her home. And so, of course, I signed up for it, said, yes, I'll be there. I was the only man in the class, but that's beside the point. To me, it was this fascinating exploration of a new way of expressing creativity, of a new way of taking imagery from thought to actual form that could be visible and shared. And I didn't really know how one taught a painting class. The teacher that the wife of the owner of the art supply store had found was someone who had an associate's degree in art, if I remember correctly, from some state university. Her basic presentation for the purposes of that informal class was that she would bring in a painting she had done, and we would all try to copy it. And which, in one sense, sounds rather hokey, shall we say. You're just copying somebody else's work, but she explained right away at the beginning that even if she herself tried to copy the painting, she wouldn't be able to do an exact copy, which is why when occasionally there have been people who have done forgeries of paintings by the great painters of history, that in itself is an incredible accomplishment, because to develop that kind of precision in brushstroke and exact hue is just, it's phenomenal. The number of variables that have to be brought into perfect harmony in order to do it. And everyone joked with me as they were teasing me after I started doing a few paintings in the class. And gee, you can't even see the numbers anymore. It's like, no, this is not paint by numbers. This is a blank canvas where we mix the paints, because we almost never used to paint straight out of the paint tube. The blue was always tinted with something else, a little bit of white, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of all sorts of different things. So the first real challenge of learning to paint was figuring out how the colors mix and what color you wind up with when you put these two together and these two together, and in what amount you put them together. But as I was somewhat attempting to copy the teacher's paintings, I found my imagination jumping up and saying, well, how about this? And I started doing it. Well, I said, well, there's no rules, why not? And so I took what was in the picture, the teacher's painting, and I began reforming it and shifting the color and changing the perspective. And the results were quite wonderful, actually. Just briefly, an example was a sapling in a cow pasture with a tiny little stream, maybe a foot or two wide, next to it, and a forest in the distance, I think. And that was her picture. I kind of began to stylize it and blend it together, and then as I was looking at it, not quite realizing, I mean, I hadn't decided in advance what I was going to do with it, but somehow when I painted the tree, it didn't look like a sapling anymore. It looked like a really, really big tree, and a really old tree. And it suited me more somehow. There was a certain resonance inside, I guess. I'm not sure how to describe it. That when I painted the field, it wasn't individual blades of grass. It was subtle blendings of color, going from yellow into almost a whitish sort of color, and then into orange and red. I don't recall ever seeing a red field, but somehow it looked like that's what it was supposed to be. And then putting in this cow path along the stream, and by the time I had made the tree big, the tiny little 1 or 2 foot wide stream was now a river about 20 or 30 feet wide, and the cow path was more of a hiking trail. And I was trying to decide where to go with this, because the picture looked unfinished. And I said, well, how about if I put a park bench underneath the tree? And the teacher looked at me and said, a park bench? You want to put a park bench under the tree? Okay, it's your picture. Well, and I looked at it and I decided what the park bench should look like, and I painted this tiny little park bench. And the next time she walked behind me, she said, oh my God, look what you've done. And because it had changed the entire picture, and suddenly it had taken on this interesting tension of as if there was some sort of special spiritual energy to the place, as if it was a place of transformation. And the cow path was now a trail where somebody, or a walkway where somebody would walk along meditating on some deep life issue, and sit on the bench to collect their thoughts and perhaps have an epiphany or an insight or a mental breakthrough of some kind. And then, of course, with these trees, this forest that was way in the distance, it only made sense to have a tiny little church right on the edge of the forest. Not so much to bring Christianity in the picture as to bring in a symbol of a place of worship, of a sacred space, and that there was a relationship between this opportunity for growth and deep thought in the foreground and this focus on spirituality in the background, that spirituality is somehow always part of our deepest thoughts, whether we recognize a specific deity or not, that there is something about our deepest thoughts and about spirituality both that take us beyond ourselves. In applying all this to life, and is it linear, is it cyclical, is it spiral, does it repeat? As I said, there's a sense in which it never exactly repeats, but there may be ways that it comes back for another expansion of an earlier idea. That what we thought we learned then, we learned at the level we could learn it. But what we're learning now is the same thing taken to a much deeper level and a much bigger playing field. That you might learn, for example, if you're studying government, you might learn how a student government functions in a high school. Then you might learn about municipal government and running for city council. And then you might learn about the state legislature. And then you might learn about the national legislature. And then you may even be fortunate enough to see the United Nations in full session, where hundreds of countries' representatives are all sitting down in this intricately engineered space with interpreters and language translations and presentations and speeches as they wrestle with issues of inherent civil rights, human rights, what it means to be human, what it means to be a collaborative, integrated world, seeking peace for all people, seeking adequacy for all people, that no one go hungry, that there be a way, an alternative, by which war is not the answer. Or as one person put it, if war is the answer, for crying out loud, what was the question? If, in a similar way, if violence is the answer, what was the question? I personally don't think violence is the answer to anything. If anything, violence and war become the ways that we grow tired of the circle and tired of the repetition, and we attempt to short circuit it, to cut through somehow, and find that you cannot cut through the normal progression of the spiral without risking the life of the whole progression, without risking the life of the journey. Just as the rings of a tree are added very, very slowly, only one per year, and the oldest trees have more rings than we can count. To cut through from the center to the outside, or vice versa, either way, in an effort to count the rings prematurely, you would wind up killing the tree. The only way you can safely or intelligently get an accurate count of the rings of the tree is to wait until the tree has completed its life and basically died. And at that point, and not before, is when you will find the maximum number of rings, the maximum age of the tree. If children try to be grown-ups before they have grown up, disastrous things can happen. There is a sense in which we need to be where we are, but we also need to understand that we're not where we were, and we're not where we will be. That there is a progression. At the same time, what makes this even more of a challenge is that we are all on different progressions, not necessarily in synchronicity with each other. And being further along in one area does not make one superior to someone who is not as far along in that area, but maybe further along than myself in another area. Each of us is a multidimensional being with a lot of different levels of growth at the same time. One of the curious things about gay men coming out and living openly as gay men within the last 50 years or so is that in many, many, many cases, they were now considered middle-aged or even elderly. And in coming out, finally getting to that point where emotionally and psychologically and perhaps not necessarily sexually, but kind of sexually, but not sexually in the physical sense, but sexually in the relational sense, of wanting to make connection and contact with another person. which is way beyond physical and frequently involves the mind as much or more than it involves the body. Sexual relations are really so much a matter of the mind and of the consciousness and of our values and of how we see the other person, whether we see them as valuable or whether we see them as something to be used for our own narcissistic, selfish gratification. But the problem that many gay men were running into is that physically they were late middle-aged, and emotionally and psychologically they were a teenager, and trying to come to terms with all the emotions they were not allowed to feel during their teenage years because they weren't allowed to discover the truth of themselves at that time, because society wasn't ready for them to exist at that time, even though they had been born and lived within that time. I don't know how much of a consolation it is, but the pages of most history books are filled with references to individuals who, well, one way of describing it, I suppose, is that they were quite literally ahead of their time. They were envisioning things that people in their own times couldn't accept. They were writing music that people in their own times couldn't appreciate. They were designing inventions and creating gadgetry and operating according to values that people in their own respective times were unable to embrace or to accept or to support. Thankfully for us, their work was not lost with time, but was somehow recorded or passed on or something until such time as the rest of humanity could learn to appreciate it and to embrace it and to benefit from it because of opening up to it. If we don't open up to the circle, the line will not be able to find its meaning. There is a sense in which our lives through time is a line. We have a birth date and a death date. There is a beginning and an end, and at some point we will simply have run out of time. Individually, I mean. That, all the places you wanted to travel, all the people you wanted to see, all the things you wanted to do, if your life didn't include love and truth, I would be tempted to say it's misspent, but it's really not my place to make that sort of judgment. That's something each of us has to measure for ourselves and looking in the mirror. Have I used the gift of life as wisely as I could? In this curved line that I have to where it starts and where it ends, maybe I moved in a spiral, maybe I moved in a straight line, maybe I moved in some other winding spaghetti trail. I think it is not so much that God judges us as that we judge ourselves by the things that we do and the choices we make. Does history need to keep repeating itself? I suppose it's not that history needs to keep repeating itself, as that each individual within history needs to learn and to grow in certain ways. And if those needs overlap or are similar or analogous to what others in previous times have faced, there may be insights from their struggles that can benefit our own, and that in a sense can empower us to make better progress if we listen enough to pay attention to what others have been through and how others have answered the question. To look at how for example, one of the books I'm reading bit by bit of late is called Every Man Dies Alone, and it's a whole narrative based on a real story, a really true, historically true story that wasn't even mentioned when I was going through all of my public education years, and how tragic that it was left out. In this particular case, the book is called Every Man Dies Alone, and it's about German resistance to the Nazis from within Germany during World War II, and people who literally put their lives on the line, and some of them who were absolutely executed In this particular case, there were a couple people who saw what was going on as absolutely morally and ethically wrong, and they weren't politicians, they weren't teachers, they weren't anybody, they were just ordinary working people. But they knew they had to do something, that they couldn't just be blind and deaf and apathetic and complacent about it. They had to do something for the sake of their own sanity, because what was happening around them was so completely insane. And so they began creating these handwritten, very amateurish looking postcards with anti-Nazi slogans and leaving them all over the place. Just two people. The interesting, amusing point as I was skimming through the book when I first got it was that the Nazi administration that was trying to so completely control the way German people thought and acted and believed during that time, that these postcards were showing up in so many places and in such abundance that they were quite sure there was a very complex and efficient organization behind it. And it amazed them when they found out that the whole work was done by only two people. But they were Germans living within Germany throughout World War II, and it was toward the end of World War II as the Nazi regime was crumbling, because perhaps in some ways because of its own violence, gradually beginning to burn itself out. But nevertheless, the violence of the Nazis was horrid, and throughout all that time they remained there, and they knew their lives were forfeit, and they did what they could to the last minute, till they were ultimately caught and, in this case, actually beheaded. Which, of course, and I mentioned that to a friend, and we're both a little astonished, because as far as the history we were taught, we hadn't heard of the guillotine being used since the French Revolution. To think that it was used within the 20th century was a bit of an eye-opener. I don't know why it couldn't have been used all along, but I don't remember ever hearing of it. All of which opens up this question when we're dealing with history and trying to discover whether it's linear or cyclical, and to what degree it's cyclical, and to what degree are we simply learning the lessons that could have been learned before because we weren't paying attention, because there were books we hadn't read, because there were things we hadn't understand, or lives we hadn't valued. We don't need to keep doing this. Every struggle that happens, I strongly suspect, could be described as an echo of an earlier struggle. But there are so many struggles that humanity has endured, and so many things that people have done, and so many different ways that man has been totally inhumane toward other mankind, that it's as if we're not so much occupied with creating new history as with remembering and integrating the history that has already happened, because there's so much. And so much that we've forgotten also. I have to think that when the library at Alexandria was burned some 2,000 years ago, that there were records there going back much further than anything we know about at this point. And so large chunks of our own history have most likely been forgotten. Whether we'll ever be adequately reminded of them, some people say that we have been, but curiously, they don't come up with the same answer. So many different answers out there. All that being said, it seems to me that there is some point, some way in which all these different threads can be woven together into a cohesive, coherent story. And the spirals and the lines will all converge into a wholeness where we can all look at each other and smile and say, now it makes sense. I wish somebody would have told me that before. I don't think we have to repeat history. I don't think we should be afraid of repeating history either, though. If we didn't learn it before, one of the most wonderful things about life is that more often than not, there are ways to go back and pick up the pieces we forgot. Address the things we overlooked. embrace the ones that we would have liked to embrace, but perhaps we weren't in the place we needed to be to think of doing that at the time. Then again, there are other times where the heart may tell us to let go and keep moving on. It's a spiral, and their spiral has taken them in other directions, so that making a detour back to reconnect may be a digression that would serve no purpose anymore. In all the interweaving of life, though, in saying, is this linear, is this circular? Well, it's both. It's within every person. There are aspects that are linear and sequential, and there are aspects that are circular and spiral and repetitious. And there are things that, and questions with which I wrestle, that I'm quite certain there were people 2,000 years ago wrestling with the same questions. There is something about this complex, infinite mystery of life that thankfully continues to intrigue us, something about relating to the spiritual that continues to inspire us. Perhaps because in some sense we really do become more than we are, more than the lines and more than the circles and more than the spirals, by reaching for that which is beyond us and curiously often hidden within us in a way that we didn't notice it before.